I never knew her, yet she played an important part in my life because I'd always heard stories about her, heard things about her. Yet, when we're told stories about our grandparents, we always only focus on those that we knew. But I thought that because, our bloods are the same, I would use her name, Rios. So that's where the second name came from. But I think also Rios has a certain significance, a certain symbolism. In English it means river or water. A river is always moving. And very much like this character, Pepe Rios, he is always moving from one place to another. He can't sit still too long. Sometimes because it's his own fault, other times because just a situation moves him from one place to another. And following the metaphor of the river, some situations that he gets into are very rugged, very rough, and others are very calm. So I think that's where the names came from. The whole first part of the novel really takes place as it was told to me about what happened to my grandfather when he was in Mexico, about why he left Mexico, about where he lived, that he came from a fairly wealthy family. They had a lot of cattle, a lot of land, and then his father was murdered. We never know what happened from the time he left that ranch in Mexico until the time he arrived in the United States. So most of the journey itself is fictitious. I had to either make that up with stories I'd heard about battles of the Revolution and kind of imagine what he went through during that time to get here. The entire series of books will be a trilogy, and I've wanted specifically to set the book in Santa Monica and the west side of Los Angeles because essentially that's where I was raised. I guess you could say I was born to a lower middle class family, and my father and mother, they worked our way up into West Los Angeles, and I moved into a pretty solid middle class family. The neighborhood in which I lived, there was a mixture of races. There were 2 or 3 Mexican families, 2 or 3 Asian families, 4 or 5 Anglo families. So it was suburbs of the city, so it was a really good, strong middle-class background. I went to private schools most of my life, Catholic schools, which many of the people in the neighborhood where I grew up went to private schools also. And I went to school at St. Sebastian Elementary School in West LA, and I graduated there and went to St. Monica's High School, where I graduated and never had ambitions of going to college. Nobody ever talked to me about going to college. So from there I went into the Army after a few years at Barber College that I spent some time at with nothing better to do, right? So I decided to go to the Army just about 1966. But I think I always had a side about me that was interested in words and stories and what people said. I'm not sure if I was ever consciously thinking of becoming a teacher. I remember always thinking that I wanted to write and be a writer. I don't think I was ever a point where I said, yes, I'm going to become a teacher. I think I kind of just fell into teaching. Teaching for me has been fairly new endeavor over, I would say, 7 years. And I took the job as a full-time teacher here, and I've really enjoyed it ever since. Everything I do in the classroom is really enjoyable. The people I come into contact with, the students. I think teachers are kind of rebels in a way also, and I've always had that part of me, part of the outlaw. And I think because we don't have hours like most people have, 8 to 5. Some of us come in later in the afternoon, some of us leave earlier. Sometimes we work till midnight at home. And that's a little, it's not mainstream. And I think that appeals to me in teachers also, the whole reputation about a teacher. I like to teach and to write. I think writing makes me a better teacher. And what I read in the class, what I study in the class, I think makes me a better writer also. In my mind, I was always struggling with the question of why don't Latinos read more than they do English. Those who speak Spanish read a lot of Spanish, but many Latinos or Chicanos you find don't read a lot of English. They don't read a lot of books. And partly I guess I could answer that question because many of the books that are written have nothing to do with their lives. You know, you're always reading a book about a novel about high society or about something happened to somebody in New York. It's always far away from them. So part of my intent was to write for a Latino audience. And I wanted them to get caught up in the story right away. I wanted them to think, this story is part of my story. And I thought that if I could capture them in the intrigue right away, that they would get interested in the book and they would read it. Right? It's some of the plot in fiction is a ploy. It's a ploy to keep your reader with you. So I started it heavy in that way. But also, the story that was told to be about my grandfather, that's exactly how it was told to me. There's been reactions to the portrayals of women in the book on both sides. I've gotten some criticism, positive criticism, and some negative criticism. I think the positive criticism has been that the women in the book are all very strong women, regardless of the situations that they're in, and they have been victimized. Most of their personalities you'll find are very strong, and most of them are victims of circumstances. The negative criticism has been that why do they all suffer so much? Most of them, or many of them, die later on in the book. Although the first ones who appear in the book don't. We don't know what happens to them because the book shifts from that little ranch in Mexico on to other places in Mexico. So we don't know what happens to the women early on. Which is interesting because the women early on, not only in the story as it goes on, but in reality, succeeded in making good lives for themselves. The mother, well, she remarries. I don't want to say too much because I'm giving away the second book, right? But what happened in Mexico, the people who stayed, the women who stayed in that family became much more successful than the boy who leaves and comes to the United States. And also, I think that I didn't want to hold back what I thought reality was like in Mexico for women. I mean, there's a line in there when Pepe talks about wanting to find out what's going on. He says something like, I need to go see Rosa because the women always know what's going on. In fact, they fool the men. The men think